Oh, yeah? It's phone call. Odd confusion is there's a public hearing in our banquet room today. It's really small. It's for Tetra Tech. It's a shipyard thing. I asked him, how many are you expecting? Well, he said, we're expecting probably 10 or 11 people. I don't know. Something should go. Check, two. Yep.
about your vote and you want to make an educated vote, and I appreciate you being here. I do want to say that we are being live streamed by Channel 6, which is great. So there's going to be a question and answer period, and we're just going to ask you to go to the mic and ask your question, and it's pointing in that direction so, you know, the camera can capture you. I also want to put a very special thanks to our moderator tonight. We are so lucky to have our state senator, Mark Lawrence, chair of the Energy, Utility, and Technology Committee, which is, of course, what this is all about. And Mark has just driven down from the State House to be here to moderate this, and is just heading right back for more work with Jeff. So thank you, Mark. Would be proud. I'd like to remind everybody, Mark grew up in Kittery. So, all right. Well, thank you very much again, and again, write down your questions as they come, because there's going to be an important chance to ask these folks, you know, to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I want to welcome you all here, and it's wonderful to have you, and I want to welcome my friends from around Maine who've come down to come to my district. I know Al and Charlotte and Jim. I've known Jim maybe 35 years in the legislature and served with Charlotte, and Al was just before our committee shortly. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the Kittery Star Theater. This was actually my junior high school, and I started my acting career on the stage back there. It's not named Star after me, so. And I think it was actually that spot right there where I was caught slow dancing too close to somebody by the principal in junior high school. He used to come around with a ruler and measure that we were at least 12 inches apart, so that was the rule. That was Kittery back in the 1960s, if you can believe it or not. So we're here today for a very important issue, and I just want to introduce who these speakers are and then talk a little bit about why we're here and what this referendum is all about. So Our Power is a coalition of Maine ratepayers, youth leaders, and small business and energy experts, and others committed to putting Pine Tree State's energy future in the hands of Mainers. They are a statewide initiative fighting to pass the ballot measure on November 7th to create a consumer-owned utility called Pine Tree Power Company, a power company owned by Mainers for Mainers, and is possible. And they have a chance to build towards that on Election Day. The speakers are the campaign manager, Al Cleveland. Al is a seasoned organizer with almost a decade of experience in electoral and issues campaign. As a young queer trans person, they are dedicated to building just, thriving communities. Al has been a volunteer, fundraiser, and leader in campaigns around tenant rights, protecting LGBTQ youth, and strengthening democracy with elections and ranked choice voting. Most recently, Al managed a statewide campaign to end youth criminalization and incarceration in Maine. Lucy, and I know I'm going to mispronounce your last name, Lucy. I think it's Hochschnarder. Hochschnarder, thank you.
No worries at all.
Lucy is a deputy campaign manager. Lucy grew up on an educational farm in a small town and saw both the climate crisis and the exploitation of rural economies. From that experience, Lucy has worked around the country with both the youth climate movement and candidate campaigns with a focus on climate policy, analysis, and utility issues. She is also an elite biathlete racing for Team USA and is supporting Pine Tree Power so that, as she says, the utility can be owned by Mainers for Mainers. And then the Maine Affordable Energy Coalition. The Maine Affordable Energy Coalition is made up of over 10,000 individual Mainers and 120 labor unions, associations, small businesses across the state who oppose the takeover of the state's electric utilities. The speakers are Jim Cohen. He's a partner at Verlin Dana LLP, where he has been practicing energy law for the past 30 years. Jim is also a former city councilor and mayor of the city of Portland. He is currently board chair of the Northern New England Passenger Rail Authority. Charlotte Warren is a social worker, educator, community organizer, and consultant. A former state representative, Charlotte has served as the House Chair of the Legislature's Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee, Maine's Mental Health Working Group, and the Commission to examine reestablishing parole. She is an organizer with the Maine Recovery Advocacy Project, a steering committee member of the Maine Drug Policy Coalition, and an advisory board member of Maine's Prison Education Partnership. Charlotte is an adjunct professor at the University of New England and Colby College. So we're pretty honored to have them here, and what brings us here is a referendum that's going to be on the ballot this year. I hearken back to the 80s and 90s when I first entered the Maine legislature. Utilities were both generators of electricity and transmitting and distributing it to Mainers. Utility companies, Central Maine Power is one of them. Bangor Hydro was another one. They own the power production, usually dams, nuclear power plants, different coal-fired or other type-fired energy power plants, and they distributed that energy to us as customers. Back in the late 90s, Maine, like most states, broke up the utilities and separated the generation from the transmission and distribution. And the policy behind that was the belief that if you break apart the generation and turn generation over to the competitive market, that will bring down energy production prices, which is proven to be true in most respects. And then you save the transmission and distribution for a separate company that is CMP and now Versant in Maine. So those are the two large publicly traded or actually privately owned utility companies in Maine. Maine also has, I believe it's 5 or 6 smaller, what we call COUs, consumer-owned utilities. Kennebunk Light and Power is one of them here in York County, and they serve maybe 5% of Maine utility customers. The other 95% are served by Versant and CMP. Back in the 129th legislature, when Dean Reichertson and I were serving on the Energy, Utilities, and Technology Committee, a bill came in to essentially allow a private entity, or a consumer-owned entity to purchase Central Maine Power and Versant Power if they wanted to. That was a bill we considered in the 129th Maine legislature 14 years ago. It ended up not passing. There was not a coalition in the legislature that got behind it, but it did end up in a study being done by the PUC, which I think they're going to refer to many, many times. I think it was the London School of Economics that did that study, funded by the PUC, looking at the feasibility of requiring these privately owned utilities to be sold to a public or consumer-owned or government-owned type utility. And that report came back to our committee. The principal sponsor of the bill in the legislature was somebody who I co-chaired the EUT committee with, Representative Seth Berry, and he came back with another proposal in the last legislature, the 130th. And that was much more formalized. It was essentially to send out to the voters the question of whether or not a board should be set up of kind of ratepayer-run elected officials to essentially buy out Versant and CMP as they saw fit. That bill passed the legislature. It was then vetoed by the governor, so it never ended up going out to referendum, and that led to the citizens-initiated petition being circulated now that's going to be on the ballot. A citizens-initiated petition is in our Constitution. It says citizens of the state of Maine who gather enough signatures can actually submit a bill to the legislature, and if the legislature fails to enact it, then it goes out to the people to vote on whether it is going to be enacted. And this citizens-initiated petition came before our committee last week. Everyone here was there testifying on it, and we decided as a committee to allow this essentially to go out to the public, to be decided by the public. And in our deliberations as a committee over the last 4 years, I can say this is a very involved decision. You're going to hear a lot of different sides on this, and it really belongs for the citizens who are paying the electric bills to decide whether this is an avenue they want to take. The format for tonight is going to be 15 minutes for each side to present, and then we're going to open it up for questions. If you guys get stumped, I know these guys. I have some wicked tough questions to ask them on this issue to try to bring out some of the issues. But then I decided it was best, since they're the proponents, to allow our power to go first. They can state their position, and then I'll ask the other side to get up and state their position. So come on up.
Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to be here, and I'm going to try to figure out I'm a very tall person. And thank you so much to Lynn and all of the folks at the Kittery Democrats for organizing this important conversation. We are so, so thankful to be here. My name is Al Cleveland. I am the campaign manager for the Pine Tree Power campaign. And I'm here because I am 25 years old, and it is my generation that will be inheriting the climate emergency that we see ourselves in and the high energy costs that continue to be the status quo. Right now, we have seen Central Maine Power continue to fail our communities, neighbors, and friends. I'm here because I have heard for years and years my neighbors and my people be unable to pay their skyrocket high electric bill. I have heard from community solar developers that they have been stopped and delayed by CMP at every advance to build the renewable energy economy that this state needs. I have heard stories from people on oxygen tanks that they need to live, being threatened to have their power shut off and being denied payment plans and not knowing how they were going to survive. And I have heard story and experience myself many times of being left in the dark and cold too long with an unreliable electric grid. And for all of those reasons and more, we are excited to share that we have an ability to transform Maine's electric grid this November by passing the Pine Tree Power Company, a consumer-owned, nonprofit electric grid that would have your interests at heart, because us as Mainers would be responsible for electing their board of directors. The timing is necessary to happen now. We know that we are failing to meet our climate goals and reach our potential, which is why we have seen consumer-owned utilities as one of the only models of how we can get to our renewable energy goals. CMP has been ranked dead last in customer and business satisfaction over and over again, some of the worst power outages in this country, yet some of the highest rates. Lucy and I and our entire campaign are asking this question: why do we continue to pay a company that has bad reliability, high rates, and is failing to respond to our climate needs when we could be building a power company that works for us because it's run for us? We know that Mainers work hard, which is why we need to have a power company that works just as hard as we do. We need to have a power company that is accountable to us and our communities, and not foreign corporate shareholders that don't live in Maine and don't care about the people who live here. I am so thrilled to be running this campaign because it is been built by the brilliance of people with a vision for how we decarbonize Maine's grid, and it has shown me over and over again that Maine really does have the brilliance to be able to run our electric grid. What we need is voters to join us this fall in voting in support.
Thanks so much, Al. I'm also tall, so I'm going to leave the microphone here. Great to be with you all today. Thank you so much for coming, and so happy to be able to talk to you about Pine Tree Power. Similar to Al, what really brought me to this campaign was my personal story. I grew up on an educational farm in a small town and saw the way that rural communities deal with extractive economies. My home was a place for the people who were taking money away from it, whether it was tourists or loggers or miners. Throughout history, its role had been to serve the profits of others. And that's really, to me, what the heart of the proposal comes down to, is that's what Central Maine Power and Versant Power are doing. They're extracting money from our communities and sending it to their corporate shareholders all across the world and not here in Maine. And the other thing that I experienced growing up as a young person was living in the shadow of the climate crisis. I've known about the climate crisis for as long as I can remember. I remember being 10 or 11 and told, you have this massive world-ending problem and you can turn out the lights. And I thought, that's a small solution for what seems like a really big problem. So I've scaled up. What if we actually change how we turn on the lights? And I think that's really how we're going to get to a better future here, one where I'm not having to watch my mom try and buy hay during a drought, one where I'm not watching the mountains that I live by be changed by tropical storms in the Northeast, which is kind of an oxymoron in and of itself. The climate crisis is here right now, and this is our solution available this November. And that's the first thing I really want to talk with you about how Pine Tree Power really is the climate solution that we need. Pine Tree Power, to start, lets us get rid of some of the biggest anti-climate lobbyists in the state, CMP and Versant. We've seen over and over again. On the one hand, CMP and Versant will say, we're doing our best, we support climate action, and then they go right back and lobby for bills that delay the very solutions that our communities depend on. Whether you live here in Kittery or all the way up in Fort Kent, we see that Mainers are dealing with the climate crisis here and now, with rising sea levels, warming waters, collapsing fisheries, dying timber. This is a problem that is not just about the environment looking pretty. This is about our very survival. And CMP and Versant are delaying those solutions. They've had to admit wrongdoing and pay a fine for delaying the interconnection of solar. And then they also just do to continue to spend money lobbying. The thing that Pine Tree Power will also allow us to do differently is build the grid that we need. Maine has a really interesting situation that allows something like Pine Tree Power to work really well for climate change. They may say, we're only a transmission and distribution utility. We don't control supply. We don't control the dirty power plants. That's true. Pine Tree Power will be the same. It'll just control the grid. But in Maine, we actually have really clean electricity for the most part. There's work to do, but we're doing pretty well. What we don't have is clean transportation or clean heating. Our transportation is around 50% of the state's emissions, and we heat with heating oil here. We have the highest reliance on heating oil in the nation, which is an incredibly dirty way to heat our homes. What we need to do is electrify everything. We need to have electric transportation. We need to have electric heating. And to do that, we need a grid that is large and capable, and we need a grid that we can rely on. We need power that we can trust, so that people know that they are going to be able to be heated in the winter, that they're going to be able to get to work. CMP and Versant have not shown that they can provide that. And the other thing, just by virtue of being a nonprofit, that Pine Tree Power would be able to do is it qualifies for lower cost financing. So as we're entering this period where we need huge updates to our grid, Pine Tree Power actually allows us to do all of that more cheaply. An investor-owned utility like CMP and Versant, and this isn't their fault, it's just the model, requires them to have 8 to 10% extra for that financing. With a nonprofit like Pine Tree Power, that's just around 3%. So all of our updates will be done more cheaply. Along that line, the other thing I really love about Pine Tree Power is that it keeps money in working Mainers' pockets. It's going to save us $9 billion over 30 years. And the way that it does that is by changing that fundamentally extractive model I was talking about. So right now, we think of things as a market. What's different about CMP and Versant is that they're a monopoly that are guaranteed a profit. No matter what kind of service they provide us with, we have to pay them this guaranteed rate of return. It's legally required. And that rate of return means that they last year took home $190 million in profit from our communities. We talk about transmission lines, we talk about pipelines. That's a pipeline of money straight from working Mainers' pockets to their corporate shareholders. This CMP is owned by a company in Spain that has majority shareholder, or their biggest shareholders are Norway, Qatar, BlackRock Investments, and Versant is owned by a company that's in the city of Calgary. So these are not companies owned in Maine. And by voting yes on Pine Tree Power, we can actually keep money here in working Mainers' hands.
Thank you so much, Lucy. One thing that really excites me about the future of the Pine Tree Power Company is that we know it would be made up of an elected and an appointed group of board of directors. So rather than having to go to Spain to hear decisions about our electric grid, we will be responsible for electing people in our communities who will make decisions and be accountable to us. We have seen failures of the investor-owned utility model because their biggest interest is bringing home a profit, continuing to make their shareholders happy. But Pine Tree Power Company will have a mandate in the legislation and the bill we will be voting on to keep costs low, to protect workers, to strengthen labor rights, to provide a pathway to 100% renewable energy, and to have a focus on climate in every decision it makes. The Pine Tree Power Company will be publicly owned in the sense of we will be responsible for electing the board, and that board will be responsible for contracting with a private company that will do the day-to-day operations of how we have our poles and wires fixed. During that process, we'll have the same regulatory arm that we see right now with the Public Utilities Commission. Our legislation actually even strengthens the power of the Public Utilities Commission to be a regulatory force over the Pine Tree Power Company. Consumer-owned utilities are a tried and true model here in Maine. As Senator Lawrence mentioned, we have them here already. Kennebunk Light and Power, a lot of you might have friends or family who are ratepayers, and they see lower rates every single month. I'm seeing people nod their heads. I was just talking to some Kennebunk Light and Power ratepayers a few weeks ago. They brought a copy of their bill versus their family member's bill, and it blew my mind to see the shift. We've seen consumer-owned utilities across the country be the only utilities that have been able to reach 100% renewable energy. And we've also seen consumer-owned utilities protect people consistently with their rates and reliability. CMP has had a long time to show you that they're worth what they're saying. They've had time and time again to fix the mistakes and to put people over profits. And they have continued to make a decision every single time to not do that. The status quo is failing, and we have a real opportunity to see transformation in the state by putting power back into our own hands.
And with that, I'd really just like to reiterate what this proposal comes down to for people like Al and me, and for all of the many experts that are part of our campaign, people who have been working for a long time to make this happen. This is a tried and true solution that works because it's going to save Mainers $9 billion. It's going to allow us to have independence from these companies that are extracting wealth from our communities and not investing it back for the kind of reliability and trust we need. And we're going to be able to make investments more cheaply for the kind of grid that we need to thrive in the 21st century, one that's climate capable, one that has rural broadband, one that actually works when you need it to. And that's really why we're here today. So I'm so thankful to be here with you all, and I know that there's going to be a lot of back and forth, and I just want to emphasize that every time I hear CMP or Versant say something, I try to remember that Maine Affordable Energy is almost wholly funded by their parent company, Avangrid. They have a huge financial incentive to keep the system in place as it is. Power owned by Mainers, run by Mainers. It's a solution that's worked elsewhere in the country. It's not new, it's not scary, and it can be all of ours this November. So thank you so much.
I am not tall. I have to really lower it down. Hi, everyone. My name's Charlotte Warren, and you heard my bio. So social worker, teacher, criminal justice reformer, she has pink hair. How could she be on this side of this issue? So I just want to address the elephant in the room right now. My number one reason for being opposed to Pine Tree Power proposal is the climate crisis. I grew up on a farm in Pittston, Maine, and all my childhood, my parents in the winter would cover our farm table with newspaper, and my dad would boil up pounds of, we called them peel and eat shrimp, right? Those sweet Maine shrimp that we would all gather around the table and dip in butter and enjoy. As a high schooler, I used to smelt. I would go on the Kennebec River, I lived near there, and we would catch smelts, and then I would sell the smelts to the local Goggins IGA and make money to buy gas for my four-wheeler or oats for my horse. We don't have either of those things really anymore. We don't even have a chance of having our Maine shrimpery opened again until 2024. And basically every year we might get one night of smelting on the Kennebec River. It just doesn't freeze like it used to where I live. I still live in the same area where I was born and raised. We are facing in Maine a real climate crisis, something we can feel, something we can see. For us, it's not like this thing that they talk about on the news. We are actually living it. I don't think we can afford to be creating enemies, to be creating opponents when everybody involved in our climate resiliency, we need to be on the same side. We need to be on the same side, fighting the real opponent, which is the climate crisis. If this passes in November, there is absolutely no doubt that Maine will spend 10 years or more in court over who owns the poles and wires. I don't think CMP is for sale. I don't think Versant is for sale. I don't think they're going to just hand over the keys and say, let me show you how this station works, and let me show you how our community service portal works, etc. I don't think that's the case. So similarly to what happened in Boulder, Colorado, we'll spend 10 years fighting basically over who owns the mail delivery guy, right? The poles and wires, what delivers the electricity to our home. And then, like Boulder, Colorado, we'll probably end up saying, boy, here we are, 10 years later. We're still in court. We're going to give up now. And what we realize is that we're 10 years behind in fighting what was the real opponent. That's my number one reason. My number two reason is I've been a politician for a long time. I was a city councilor, I was a mayor, I was a legislator. I know how politics works. I know that there is already too much money in politics. The idea that we would elect the politicians who run this grid scares me because I've been a politician for a very long time. I've been on the inside. I've seen how it works, and I've seen that sometimes maybe the best person doesn't win, and sometimes maybe the smartest person doesn't win. And we're talking about the electric grid here. That's my second real concern. I just want to say, I'm not pro-CMP. I'm not all like, yay, I think they've not earned the reputation that they have. They've made some missteps. I'm just not somebody who just sort of says, let's just throw it out and start over and we'll just trust that it's going to be all right. I couldn't do that as an elected official, right? Mark and I served on a committee for a long time together, and I didn't just go, meh, it looks good, let's send it on, right? My job, when I represent my constituents, my job is to know, okay, so you're saying this, so show me how it's going to work. I still don't know many answers about the questions I have about Pine Tree Power. And I was in the legislature when we were discussing this. I was asking the questions. Tell me how this is going to be consumer-owned. It's going to be politician-run. That is definitely true. We would elect our own people to run it, but that does not mean consumer-owned. And believe me, again, as I said, progressive liberal, if this was actually a co-op, I'd be in. This is not owned by us. This is just a whole bunch of steps to then bid it out to another for-profit company which is going to run it, with a whole bunch of steps in between. To me, those seem like unnecessary steps. Again, we have an opponent, which is called the climate crisis. My third reason is just the $13.5 billion, or $9 billion, right? Both sides, we have a disagreement of how much it's going to cost. Regardless, we're talking about billions of dollars. And that has to come from somewhere. And the thing I've also learned, being a politician for all these years, is that it's always going to come from us. So those are my three reasons. And now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Shar. Thank you, Senator Lawrence, Lynn, all of you for being here, and Al and Lucy, thank you for your remarks earlier. My name is Jim Cohen, and as Senator Lawrence said, I've been an energy lawyer for over 30 years. Right now, a lot of the work that I do is on behalf of solar generators. I work with them to help them interconnect to the grid, and it has been frustrating. I also, as a mayor, was firmly invested in trying to combat climate change. I had a task force called Sustainable Portland. I was the first mayor in the state of Maine to sign on to the U.S. Conference of Mayors Climate Action Plan. And so I think both Shar and I share many of the same goals of our power, but we disagree that the plan to take over CMP and Versant is the best way to get there. In fact, we think that we will be setting ourselves back and doing harm to our efforts to try to address climate change. The first point I want to make, and I think Shar touched on it, is yes, Central Maine Power and Versant are for-profit companies. But this is not a model, and I think we heard earlier, there will be a for-profit grid operator. So we'll get rid of one for-profit company only to bring in another for-profit company. What have we really gained? The next point is I want to talk a little bit more about what Shar just said about politicians. I am a former politician. My wife is a former politician, and I currently am the board chair of a state authority, and they do very good work. But we also know that elections have consequences. I can't sit here in good conscience and tell any of you that I know who those 7 elected people will be. I'd like to think that those 7 people would be exactly the ones who align with my values and interests, that those will be the 7 people who will push us forward on climate goals, but we do not know that. The other point is we're not starting from scratch. If we were starting from scratch 120 years ago trying to decide, you know, what's the best model that we should pick for our electric grid, it would be a reasonably close call, and there'd be arguments on both sides. But we are not starting from scratch. The starting point is we have to take somebody else's assets, and that costs money, and that puts us very far behind. So all of you who may have a copy of this handout, there's a timeline And I'll just briefly touch on what that timeline is because it's very important. The starting point is there's an election in November. If Pine Tree Power passes, a year from now, we'd be electing our first board. 18 or so months after that, that board will hire consultants, it will evaluate. They must take over CMP and Versant. It is not an option. So there'll be a process. We're now well into 2026 at this point. At that point, CMP and Versant aren't for sale. The prices that we've heard thrown around are wildly divergent, so this will end up in court. I represented 2 small utilities in the 90s, 2 small utilities, each one of those cases involving a legislatively created district taking over a private company. Those cases took 3.5 years. Now magnify that to our entire electric grid, 5 years is not unreasonable. We're now into 2031 before we even know how much it costs to take over the grid, if it's even constitutional. You'll note there's a green bar. That's the governor's climate action plan. It comes and goes where we're still fighting about not how to best address climate change, we're talking about who owns the grid. But it doesn't end there, because at that point, we have to pick that private operator. We don't know who that will be. National Grid is an English company that serves a lot of New England. It could be another company with foreign roots running our grid. It could be nobody. There have been instances, and there are not many times where these things go all the way to their conclusion. We may not have a grid operator. That is possible. And we don't know who it will be. But whoever it is, it will take a year, 2 years for them to hire all their staff, have all new systems. And if you remember the Fairpoint takeover, that didn't go so well. So there is risk involved. And then there will be a RFP 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road. And as a company, you have to ask yourself, is that really what I want to invest in Maine? So in Long Island Power Authority is actually the model for Pine Tree Power Company. The grid there is not doing well. The state of New York is studying. They want to get rid of their grid operator. They couldn't find anyone else to operate the grid, so they were stuck with PSEG of New Jersey. That's who's running the grid. Puerto Rico is actually the very same model. They've had outages that have lasted not days, not weeks, but months and sometimes years. And again, that's not to say that's what would happen for Maine. We've heard that there are other consumer-owned utilities in Maine, and that's true. And there is one right up the road in Kennebunk. And if you look at the map that's in front of you, you'll see that there are many different sizes and shapes of consumer-owned utilities. So the 2 biggest utilities in Maine, CMP and Versant, are also the 2 largest. Kennebunk, Madison, Holton, Van Buren. Those are municipal utilities. They're very small. They have thousands of customers, not tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands. They occupy a small footprint. Kennebunk, I believe, has 7 linemen and 44 line miles. So yeah, it's not surprising that it's cheaper to operate. But then if you look at Eastern Maine Electric Cooperative, that's a rural utility, not very dense, and it turns out that consumer-owned utility has worse reliability than CMP and Versant and rates that are about the same. And then if you look at those islands, those are also consumer-owned utilities, higher rates and worse quality of service. Nationally, consumer-owned utilities that are rural electric cooperatives, those are the larger ones, have worse reliability than investor-owned utilities. So again, I can't predict the future. I can't tell you how much it's going to cost to take over CMP and Versant. I can't tell you exactly how long it will take. I can't tell you who the board will be. And anyone who tells you that they can tell you those things simply doesn't have a crystal ball to tell us the future. So we look forward to further dialogue. We look forward to answering all of your questions. And we would urge you not to support this question on November. Thank you very much.
So this is the fun part. As you can see, they're all very skilled in making their points, and I've had 4 years of this. And I've gotten to ask all the questions I wanted to ask. So now's the chance for you to ask your questions. Dean, I'm going to go to you first. Come on down. And I want you to be on mic so we can hear it. So come down and ask your question. And I'd like to give both sides to respond, a chance to respond to each question. Yeah, if you want to come down, if you do have a question, you can come on down and we'll go through your questions.
Hello, my name is Dean Rikerson, and I served on the Energy Committee for 8 years. And when I heard about this proposal 5 years ago, or the idea, I thought, what a great idea, because I am not a fan of CMP. So I started doing my hundreds of pages of research looking into the question, and I looked at the Long Island Power Company. I said, here's a company who went out, a utility that basically went out of business because they supported a nuclear power plant that was not allowed to be built. And so another consumer-owned utility took over, and I said, wow, what a great story. And then I looked into it a little more, and I said, these guys didn't do a good job. I mean, it's really not a success story at all. So there's a lot of unknowns, as Jim said. And I am totally undecided. I don't like CMP at all. But I would urge you, when you look at these questions, not to think that voting for a consumer-owned utility is going to be decarbonization. We can do decarbonization, and we have been doing it very well for the electric utilities. And we don't know what a consumer-owned utility would do. So I'm undecided.
Do you have a question?
My question is, what is the backstop when if this passes, we have the consumer-owned utility, and we have trouble like they did in Long Island? What is the backstop? What is the assurance that we could actually make this work?
So I'll ask Al Power to answer first. Why don't
Thank
you go?
you. Is this working? Fantastic. Thank you so much for that question. Right now, we are living in an electric grid that is expensive, unreliable, and not meeting our goals. That is the status quo. The people who are making decisions about how CMP operates are not in Maine, and they do not answer to Mainers. So we know the Pine Tree Power Company would have it in its mandate. And I really recommend all of the folks who are voting in November to read the full legislation, read the mandate, to see how this will be a power company that is responsible for low cost from day one, protecting workers, providing reliable service, and expanding the grid infrastructure that we truly need. The backstop to this is knowing that we are more likely to have accountability with a utility when we elect the board and we know who the board of directors are. I will say, as a young person who has been doing political organizing and advocacy since as I was 13 years old, I might have a little bit of a different perception on how my elected officials have served me. For me, I have found private shareholders, corporate and corporations to consistently never value me. It has only been through the relationships with the people in my community that I have found folks who are fighting for me and willing to put in the time and energy that we need to meet our goals.
Can I just add one thing? The other thing I'd add is that unlike many other consumer-owned utilities, Pine Tree Power would actually have the same regulation from Maine's Public Utilities Commission as well. So not only we get double the accountability, not only I couldn't tell you who the final decision is going to be under with CMP and Versant. We've read lots of articles where workers are quoted as saying, you know, everything's got to go to Spain for approval. We know that there's someone out there, but if I have a problem, I don't know who to call. With Pine Tree Power, we'll know who to call. That's our first thing. Then we can vote them out if we don't like them. And then the third thing is that we'll still have our Public Utilities Commission as well. So there's lots of avenues for that backstop.
I can't tell if it's, is that working?
Maybe you do.
Thank you, Representative Rikerson, for the question. And I think the question was, what is the backstop if something goes wrong? Well, first order of business is that if we are the ratepayers and there are no shareholders, if something goes wrong, it falls to the ratepayers because there are no shareholders to backstop the problem. So let's assume there's a storm and the storm repair costs are far more than we expect. Today, Central Maine Power and Versant Power shareholders absorb some of that risk. If there are no shareholders, there's no one to absorb that risk other than us. When Central Maine Power or Versant do something we don't like and the Public Utilities Commission says, we don't like what you did, we're going to penalize you. If Pine Tree Power's board or the private management company does something the Public Utilities Commission doesn't like, there is no one to punish. There are only ratepayers, which is us. And so one of the reasons that many former PUC commissioners have come out against Pine Tree Power is for that very reason, that they feel that it's much more likely that they can effectively regulate the utility when there is somebody who has an incentive to comply. There are studies that show that government-owned entities are less compliant than private companies. In Texas, when there were terrible outages as a result of an unexpected cold snap, it was the consumer-owned utilities that struggled and one actually went bankrupt. The investor-owned utilities were able to weather the storm because they had private shareholders to absorb the risk. And so by passing the risk off to shareholders, that benefits us. If everything fails, consumer-owned utilities will ultimately have to fall back on taxpayers. If a consumer-owned water utility fails, the taxpayers are at risk. If Pine Tree Power fails, ultimately it's taxpayers at risk. And you can read all the words you want in the bill, and you can say that it won't be on us. But when push comes to shove, if the alternative is that the lights go out, somebody's going to have to step up, and those are going to be taxpayers. So that's why we should think very carefully before we make a change like this.
I would just like to add, I think we all have lived in a world where we've often been quite disappointed by the policy decisions that our politicians have made. And we can blame it on a lot of things. Maybe it's money in politics. Maybe it's because a certain group has more money, they have lobbyists, et cetera, et cetera. But look at the examples just in the last few years. These are from my perspective. Remember, progressive, liberal. From my perspective, under the dome, we worked very hard for gun control. Politicians make a lot of campaign promises. Have you seen any of it happen? In Maine?
We know the guys who are tasked with doing it. We can call them up on the telephone. I don't know how to call people in Spain.
About gun control?
It's happening today, isn't it?
What we've done in Maine is consistently expand access to firearms. In Maine, under the dome, what has happened is we've consistently expanded access. That is actually the truth. And I have actually been disappointed many times by people that we think we can hold accountable. Again, that's my perspective. So when we say, who's going to be the backstop, I think that the answer that I have is, I really don't know. And I think if I didn't say a lot of words, a lot of the questions that I would be asked I would answer, I really don't know. And that's the part that makes me really nervous, is this really is an experiment.
I have a question for the Pine Tree Power folks. What is your plan for if we, at the election that we favor you, what is the plan for taking over from CMP and Versant? So that, I mean, I can't imagine being in limbo for 10 or 20 years and possibly coming up with, you know, having to, as a ratepayer, pay part of this $13 billion cost I might have to share.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. And I just want to clear the air a little bit. There's definitely a lot of fear that gets brought up around this issue. And I just want to name that that's intentional. They know that they can't win on the service they've been providing. We are getting horrible service. Everyone here has admitted that. What the question is here is really, do we believe we have any power at all? Every answer that we hear from the other side is that, well, you're just going to have to deal with it. There's absolutely nothing we can do. And that's a tactic we see over and over and over again from utilities, large corporations, fossil fuel companies. Charlotte, who I very much admire, keeps mentioning that she's a progressive liberal, which I am so grateful for. I also am, and as a young person, what's really important to me about the progressive liberal part is not just the policies that you hold or the ideas that you have, but being able to have faith to work to change something. And so Pine Tree Power does have a plan, and it's written in the legislation. There's a period where we elect the board, and then there's a certain amount of time that we have to offer a price to CMP. They can come back within 30 days with a counteroffer. And if that can't be met, just negotiating in good faith among themselves, we bring in the Superior Court. It's all laid out. We expect it to take, we think that we'll be able to have a new power company by 2027. For reference, for those in the room, I'll be just turning 30 in the fall of 2027. This could change my life. How often is it that we have the ability to change lives in that small amount of time? This is not something that we have to live with for the rest of our lives. We do not need to pass these costs on to children, grandchildren, your own retirement funds. People on fixed incomes are some of the people who have the hardest times paying their utility bills. This is really a chance where we can have people across the political spectrum come together to change this thing that we know needs to be changed. And it's not radical, it's not new. This is something that we've seen happen elsewhere. Utilities are also bought and sold all the time. That's how we got into this situation, with CMP being owned by a utility company in Spain and Versant being owned by a utility company in Canada. They're bought and sold all the time. When they say they're not for sale, that's just not true. They are for sale. That's how we got in this situation. And so I'd really just like to emphasize that what we're offering you is the chance to say, yeah, we can come together and vote for something better. And does it seem a little scary? Yes, but it comes down to, who do we trust? Do we trust the people, our neighbors, our community members, who we know have our interests at heart? We know our fellow Mainers. I am willing to knock on doors, meet folks where they're at, talk to people who disagree with me. That's my life, that's my job, that's what I do. That is not what giant corporations do. They shove decisions down our throats with massive amounts of money that they take from our communities. So I really appreciate you all being here today.
Thank you so much, Lucy. We've been hearing the question and have heard a lot of misinformation that this process is going to take 10 to 15 years. And we know that's not true, because that's not how this question and this bill is written. This process will be complete in 3 to 4 years. And we know how we know that's going to happen for real? Because Avangrid, CMP's parent company, they own a lot of other business. They have a lot of other work to do. Why would they risk all of their business interfering with a multi-decade-long court case or its stoppage when they have to be responsible to all of their utilities? This question in Maine and us being decision makers to build public power infrastructure will lead the country in the way of utility accountability, which we know is so necessary, and we know that Mainers have consistently stood up to lead the country in policies that transform and strengthen our democratic institutions. We saw this in clean elections, we saw this with ranked choice voting, and I am so happy to know that the Pine Tree Power Company board can access clean elections funding, knowing that it's not going to be money in politics as usual, but we will have the opportunity to run candidates clean. We know right now, money in politics, holy moly. I really recommend you all to look at the campaign finance reports for this campaign to see how Maine Affordable Energy Coalition is being funded millions of dollars by Central Maine Power's parent company. Pine Tree Power, we are being funded by small dollar donations, and we don't have the kind of money to do the educational work our opposition is doing. We never will, which is why we're here today talking to you all, and we trust that Mainers will lead this campaign and lead us to victory in November.
So I guess the question was, what is the plan? And we heard a lot of information. I think earlier I walked through what the timeline was going to be. And the idea that in 2027 we'd be turning the key just simply isn't true. The board won't even be elected and organized until sometime in 2025. The very words in this proposal say it's going to be 18 months to organize themselves, to decide what to offer, to bring on board all of the things that a state agency needs. We're well into 2026, early 2027, before that lawsuit even begins. It's worth knowing that there have probably been 30 such efforts in the last 20 years where municipalities, counties, have tried to take over their local utilities. All but maybe 6 or 7 ever reached the finish line. Boulder was a good example where it was a decade of litigation, and all those costs ended up in rates. They would end up in our rates. The words here say all of the costs are automatically passed through to us as customers. And I don't know about you, but I haven't seen a lawsuit go through Superior Court, all the discovery process, get appealed to the law court, go through all the briefing, maybe go back to the starting line again and have that end in about 6 months. It was 3.5 years with 2 small utilities, and litigation has gotten longer, not shorter. We've been following the front page of the newspaper with a bunch of energy lawsuits that are going on and on and on and on. So it is real that this thing is going to take us well into the 2030s if it goes to completion at all. We heard one of the Our Power supporters for Pine Tree Power a few weeks ago say that if in the end we looked at it and said, oops, we made a mistake, maybe we'd try to put the eggs back into the shell again. We'd put the toothpaste back in the tube. But it's too late at that point. We're down the road, and when the court tells us how much are we going to pay, we won't know that till that final order comes. We think that number is $13.5 billion, using examples from the few times that one of these things has actually gone to completion. And that will be the anchor that weighs down the ability of this to succeed, because now we're paying billions of dollars in our rate. So all of our efforts at beneficial electrification get weighed down because we've made electricity more expensive. So I think we disagree on that, but I think the reality is this is going to take a very long time and cost a lot of money.
Hi, my name is Paul Drowns. I'm from Poland, Maine. I'd like to just take a really brief moment to go through the genealogy of both Versant and CMP. So Versant is wholly owned by NMAX, which is wholly owned by the city of Calgary. CMP, 100% owned by Avangrid, 81.5% owned by Iberdrola, who gets funding from KIPCO. That's a branch of the Qatar Finance Authority. So my two questions is, one, how much did CMP net last year? Number two, how much did Avangrid net last year?
I have no idea. And the reason is, I don't work for CMP.
Don't ask a
and
question you don't know.
And I don't have the,
CMP, 881 million. So this where we run out of money, if you multiply that by 10 years, that's a lot of money. In fact, that's just shy of the billion that we're accused of not knowing what to do with. How do we pay it? How do we pay it? We simply just take the shareholders out of the computation and get on with it. The other thing, what's to say that Joe Purrington wouldn't stick around and run it? Joe's the CEO of CMP.
so thank you for the question. And as I said earlier, I don't know how much CMP makes. I don't know how much Avangrid makes. I don't work for CMP. I don't work for Avangrid. Neither of us do. I'm here because I believe that this plan is not the right direction. I am aware that over many, many years, Central Maine Power has been allowed to earn a certain amount of money, and in many years, they don't make the return that they're allowed to make. I'm aware that over a decade that Avangrid did earn money and reinvested 90% of it back into Maine. So I'm aware of some of those statistics. I'm aware that Avangrid is actually one of the leading renewable energy developers in the world, in their parent company, Iberdrola. But in the end, we can talk about all of those numbers, but the number that really is going to matter to us is, are we going to improve our lives as a result of this change? We're going to go from some private company, today it's Central Maine Power and Versant, and we're going to go to some other private company we don't know, a private company that could be foreign owned, because there's nothing in these words that say otherwise. One of the proponents 2 years ago of the Pine Tree Power legislation was asked by the Utilities Committee, could Avangrid be back as the owner? And the answer was, yeah, and technically they could be. They could be back again as the grid operator. The other thing we don't know is who's going to be running the company and what their interest will be, but we do know we will be paying off the debt. And where will that debt go? It's not going to be staying here in Maine. It's going to be leaving Maine. And you can look at Long Island Power Authority. Same thing. They took over the company. They paid $8 billion. They're actually more in debt today than they were when they started. So we can talk about how wonderful it would be if we changed things, but it is also the case that change may actually move us in the wrong direction. That's why I'm up here. It's not because I'm following Central Maine Power. I'm on the other side of Central Maine Power and just about everything I do, yet I'm still here.
Thanks so much for the question. And for folks who didn't hear, I think the question asker actually knew the answer. We do know the profits from CMP and Avangrid. CMP last year took home $156 million in profit. Versant took home just about $31 million, and CMP's parent company, Avangrid, took home $881 million. That's money straight from our pockets to the pockets of their corporate shareholders. And I think we're being told a lot of the things that we don't know, which is easy to do. I'll name it up front. I'm very clearly a young person. There are lots of things that I don't know, but there are also lots of things that we do know, that all of us collectively know together. And that's that this is not working. No one has been able to tell us that this is working. And we have another model that we've seen work elsewhere that we know we can work here, because this is not just something that I, as a young person, have thrown together. This is something that went through the Maine legislature, that was passed with bipartisan support, that was studied by an international firm, London Economics International, that verified that we could have savings. This is something that's been a long time in the making. We wouldn't have gotten to this point if we had a company that worked for us in the first place, like we all work for each other.
I'm short. I'm Carol Selsberg from Elliott. I'm an old lady that likes to message depending on the day. And there's been a lot of talk about what we don't know. But what we do know, what I know, and my family knows, is that in the past several years, my bills from CMP have gone up twice, 3 times. They've tripled, at least tripled. And my research shows that Avangrid made 25% profit during the same time. Did you get the break? I didn't get the break. My position here is, you don't stay with something. You don't stay with a candidate or a plan if it's not working. You change, and you don't compare it to places like New Jersey with the nuclear, wherever the nuclear plan was. You don't say that doesn't work anymore or that won't work. You try it. You move on. So as old as I am, I believe in the young, reformative changes, and what we have now is not working for me. I don't think it's working for any of you, and damn it, when it's not working, you change it. If it's an election, if it's a company, you just change it. Wasn't I good about not using any other bad language? Because those in the audience who know me know that I use bad language. So. No, it's not so much a question as a statement about what we don't know. It doesn't matter what we don't know. What we do know is that it's been costing us too much money, and it's not being run well, and the parent company is making a blanking fortune. A fortune, which is not coming back to anybody but its shareholders in Spain and elsewhere. That's not a question. It's my message of...
So I just remind people that now is question time, so we get to ask questions of these people. We can make speeches later, but we get to ask questions. We have them here tonight, so let's put them on the hot spot and ask them the tough questions. So.
Senator, may I just respond quickly? Sure. I agree. We should always be open to changing things that we think don't work, but we should make sure that what we change them to are going to work. You do the work, I think, is how you know, and I don't think this one's ready. I think that's why Governor Mills vetoed it. I think that's why former Governor LePage is against it. I think that's why folks from both sides of the aisle are aligned that maybe in the future it's something folks come back to. I think what we're both saying is we don't disagree with everything that's being said. What we do disagree with is just because you put it on a 8 or a 10 or a 15-page bill in the legislature doesn't mean that it's going to get us the goals that I think we need to make sure we're going to get. So that's where I'm coming from. Oh, yes.
Thank you. I really appreciate hearing that reflection, and it brought to mind something that has been the most concerning to me during this campaign. I've mentioned it, I'm gonna continue mentioning it until November, but as we've seen Avangrid have ridiculous high profits, we're also seeing election maneuvering like never before. Right now, millions of dollars are going into miseducating Maine voters by scaring them to protect the status quo. We have a responsibility to each other and to our vision for a true democracy to say no to big money that comes from our pocketbooks deciding our elections. And that's why it's really important for you all to do your own research on this issue. Look up the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. Research consumer-owned utilities that represent the same size as Maine and have had incredible success getting to their clean energy goals, supporting workers, and protecting ratepayers over and over again. Compare Sacramento Municipal Utility District, SMUD, what a fun acronym, to California PG&E, the investor-owned utility that's one of the few that's gone bankrupt for investor-owned utilities and is responsible for homicide, last I heard, with California wildfires. We have seen investor-owned utility model fail us time and time again, but we have the chance to say no to profits over people by voting for Pine Tree Power.
I have an easy question, and it came up from an issue that we were discussing in my church men's group, which, to give you a little bit of background, our mission is to solve all the problems in the world. And to date, we've had fairly mixed results. But but we have a good time. We don't know what the heck we're talking about half the time, but one of the issues that came up was about transmission of electricity. So this is not like taking sides, really, but one of the guys talked about there's a lot of hydropower comes down from Canada, clean energy, and it can be used in different states, different parts of the country, because the grid is connected. The grid is all connected, right? And one of the companies that was mentioned earlier, BlackRock, I guess, this one guy in the group said, I think BlackRock's trying to invest in a transmission highway that brings this hydropower down from Canada to New York and other states. And I don't know anything about this. I'm not an expert on this, but I'm thinking, obviously, that has to be approved by the state. You can't just run another, a grid through the state and rip up the country, the land. But the question I had is, if there is power that can be brought down through Maine, using us as a bridge, so to speak, from Canada to other states, can it be brought down on our transmission lines? Do we have the capacity, the additional capacity, or can we develop the additional capacity to make revenue from that? Because obviously they're going to have to pay for that. If they're using your highway, they have to pay for it. Is there a possibility for that? Because if there is, obviously that's extra revenue that could go into the pockets of Pine Tree State. Can New York State, for instance, who wants to get that hydropower from Canada, can they use our grid to bring it down to where it's being used, where it needs to be used? That could be a good profit, possibility. But I don't know if that's a possibility, or if that's, as I say, that's from our discussion group, and we don't know what the heck we're talking about half the time. So.
Well, thanks so much for the question, and also it sounds like a great group. I appreciated that you said you're trying to fix all these problems, which is really great. That's what we're all here to do. So I appreciate that everyone's here trying to fix things. To that question in particular, what really the beauty of Pine Tree Power is to me is that we get to vote on the people making those decisions, and that we get to have a say. And so I can't say necessarily like which way, but we can say that you get a say.
Thank you again for the question. Very complex answer that we could probably be here all night for a utility wonk like myself, so I won't bore you all to death. We've spent a lot of time over the last several years talking about, can we bring electricity down? Can it go through Maine? Can it go elsewhere? The short answer is yes, it can happen. It has to go through about 6 state agencies and various federal agencies, and then there are ballot questions and a whole lot of other things that create challenges. So any of these things could happen. We don't know whether they will. What I can say is whether or not it's Pine Tree Power or Central Maine Power or anyone else, a line can get built. And who owns it? This question isn't really going to resolve that. The other thing, though, that is worth mentioning, we've heard several people talk about how our bills have gone up, and they have gone up. And that's been painful for many of us. But what's important to note, and I'm disappointed that our power says that our bills going up is CMP's fault, because since 2000, CMP hasn't been allowed to make electricity. Versant is not allowed to make electricity. They're not allowed to sell electricity. The line that we've been talking about for several years was designed to bring more electricity, create more supply of electricity, so that with more supply, our electricity costs would go down. CMP has nothing to do with that electricity. Nothing. It's on a bill, it comes from someone else, they pass it through to us. The standard offer we pay is set by the Public Utilities Commission, not by CMP. So whether it's Versant or CMP or Pine Tree Power doesn't matter, and I'd encourage you to look at this handout, which talks about our rates. And what you'll see is that 85% of what you pay in your bill today, totally unaffected by who owns the electric grid. So the other thing to note is, will this save us money? And heard a moment ago that LEI verified, LEI's London Economics, that they verified that there would be savings. And that's not accurate. What London Economics said, and they were the consultant that worked for the Public Utilities Commission, they said, it really depends on the assumptions that you make. Under certain assumptions, it might save us money. Under other assumptions, it might not. So LEI, the consultant for the Public Utilities Commission, was very clear to say, we don't know. Just last week, Phil Bartlett, the chairman of the PUC, testified in front of the Utilities Committee on this issue and said, I don't know. So it's reasonable to not know. It's great that there's tremendous optimism. I don't know what the opposite of a scare tactic is, an optimism tactic, but we don't know how great this is going to be because we can't. So none of us are standing here saying we're scaring you. We're just saying there are unknowns. So we hope that you will educate yourselves, because while we can give us our best guesses of how things will go, I don't know, they don't know. You should study it to make sure you are convinced.
Good evening. I'm Nancy Lee. I live in Elliott. We all want cheaper, cleaner, more reliable energy. But I think one thing that's sure is the world is in crisis. It's not just Maine. It's not the U.S. It's not Ukraine. It's a lot of the whole globe is in a crisis. And I think to assume with a proposal that we're going to have cheaper rates and it's going to be more reliable based on a bunch of words and objectives, I don't know, it's scary to me. And I don't think, I don't know what that's based on, because I don't know the rates worldwide. I can't name them off the top of my head, but if I'm going to do some research and try to see, but I'm pretty sure we're not paying the highest rates in the country or in the world. I know for a fact, over in Europe, they've been paying way more than we do for gasoline for decades. Decades. That's just one example. And I guess my question is to Pine Tree Power, what is the model of Pine Tree Power's proposal that is working in this country right now? You mentioned Sacramento. However, I question, there again, I have to do some research on it, but I question the size, which the size is only one metric of the issue. It's the demand, it's the type of climate you actually live in. There are a lot of issues surrounding not only the generation, but the transmission and distribution. So is that the only example of something like Pine Tree is proposing? Are there multiple examples? And I guess that's where I question, something makes me step back and say, well, if it's that great and it's working that great and their rates are so much cheaper and it's more reliable and all these wonderful things that we all want, you know, why isn't it being wildly adopted throughout the US? Because everybody would be on board with it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question and for showing up and doing the hard work and asking the tough questions and really diving into these things, because I hear that this is our power. It affects our everyday, it affects our health, it affects our heating, it affects our ability to survive. It's really important. There are lots of examples, and this is not something that is just in Sacramento or just in Maine. We've got 10 consumer-owned utilities here in Maine. The state of Nebraska uses entirely public power. There's the Sacramento Utility District. There's lots of examples of consumer-owned power. There's lots of situations where you can nitpick certain parts, like maybe Nebraska isn't as clean, but Sacramento is not as cheap. There's many different models, and Pine Tree Power has tried to take from the best pieces of all of those. And yes, there are certain guarantees I can't make, as they pointed out, and I'm thankful for them for doing that. I can't guarantee everything, but what I can guarantee is that we get a say, and we're offering an ability to do something better, and we're offering a solution. And that's just what I don't hear any other place. And that's really what has been so concerning to me, and what has actually made me more supportive of Pine Tree Power, is that this tactic of saying, well, it's going to take so long, and it just might not work, and we don't know, that's the same kind of rhetoric that has gotten us to this place today. That is exactly the same kind of rhetoric that huge oil and gas companies that have known about the climate crisis since, the first president briefed about climate change was Lyndon B. Johnson. So it's been going on for a long time. And these are companies that have used the very same rhetoric. Well, there's climate change may be real, but you can trust us. We got it. And then we see that they don't act. And so what I'm really excited about with the possibility for Pine Tree Power is the possibility for all of you who clearly have so many good ideas and so many deep personal stories around this issue to be able to get involved yourselves.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I continue to come back to a little bit about the history of utilities and how we got here in the first place. And I'm thinking back to what we know happened in the 30s and 40s, where investor-owned utilities and consumer-owned utilities were fighting for the first time. And people would build poles and wires to build collectively owned public power. And then businesses and investors would come in and just build their own poles over everything and create complete destruction. We have been being held hostage by the investor-owned utility model for so long because corporations know they can profit off of our basic needs. What we're saying is that system in and of itself is exploitative, it's extractive, and it denies us every ability to reach any of our goals. The first 6 communities in this country that will reach 100% renewable energy are consumer-owned utilities. We have seen that the only times we can meet any access to climate goals are in the COU model. And so this is one of the many reasons, to me, this is not just a debate and conversation, CMP, Pine Tree Power. This is about how do we believe that we should organize and structure the basic necessities that we need to live. And I believe, along with so many of members of our coalition, that we should not let a foreign government make those decisions for us, but we should make them ourselves.
So before you answer, Charlotte, I do have a quick question for all of you. Can you stay longer?
Yes.
Okay, so we do have some more questions. If you guys are willing to hang out, we do have this place for a while longer, so let's see if we can. It's kind of like the EUT committee. The questions never end, so please.
Thank you. I just want to respond to the sort of idea that one side giving information is fear and the other side giving information isn't. I think we both are sharing information because all of us here care very deeply about what happens in our state. We all have records of caring very deeply of what happens in our state and what happens to Maine people. So I want to just be really clear that sharing information isn't fear-mongering. But if we're talking about fear-mongering, I just want to bring up the consistent Maine, not Spain Maine, not Spain. I find it offensive. And I find it offensive because we live in a global economy. Do we wish that all money any of us ever had stayed in our pockets, stayed in our families, stayed in our state, stayed in our country? It's not the way it works. And B, I feel like this foreign country, that's a little fear-mongering. It's a little close to, for me, what friends on the other side of the aisle say a lot. To me, it feels like scare tactics. So I just really wanted to say that point and then come back to the point that we are all here to share information. We are on the side that doesn't think we have a plan yet to replace CMP and Versant. Not because we're trying to scare anyone. Please read the bill. Please look at all of the studies all of us have talked about. Please come to your conclusion, and then please vote November 7th.
So in my lifetime, I can't think of an issue that we are voting on bigger than this. When you think about billions of dollars, when you think about touching every corner of the state of Maine, when you think about this as a vital service that we all rely on, I can't think of an issue that the legislature has acted on. I can't think of an issue that we'll be asked to vote on. This is the single biggest thing that we will be asked to decide. And if we go in a direction that's wrong, that is a major risk. And I say that not to scare you. I say that to encourage you to make sure you know when you cast a vote that you're comfortable with it. Because things are not perfect right now, but they could go a lot worse. Maybe they'll go better. What is the model? I think that was one of the questions. The model was Long Island Power Authority. Long Island Power Authority, after Hurricane Sandy, was under investigation by the state of New York by the Moreland Commission. What they found was there was a revolving door of lawyers and consultants going between the private grid operator and the state authority. Just this year, the New York legislature is strongly considering whether to change that model. That's the one model in this country that this is based on. Not Sacramento, not any other place, only Long Island. And then Puerto Rico decided we're going to emulate that model a year ago, 2 years ago, and they brought in a private grid operator, and it was even worse. And if you followed the news, there are power outages in Puerto Rico that go on a long time. Now, our coalition includes the IBEW, and just last week, a representative from the IBEW talked about how he worked in Puerto Rico and how the government authority that was running the utility couldn't get its act together to have the supplies in place to make it work. So things can go very badly. Nebraska, we've heard as an example. That's not the same model either. But it's worth knowing that Nebraska is one of the dirtiest states in the country in terms of emissions. They're surrounded by a bunch of states that are run by investor-owned utilities, but Nebraska, which is mostly consumer-owned, they still are mostly coal. And 3 years ago, there was a commissioner from the state of Nebraska who came to Maine, came to the Utilities Committee and talked about how, because they had elected boards, they were more attracted to trying to keep the price low and not make investments and keep the power not as clean. That was what their motive was. So again, not trying to scare anyone, but I would encourage you, look at each one of those examples. Make up your own minds about what you think will happen.
Howdy. So, preface it with, I'm not sure I'm sided on either party, but I just have some comments and then I'll end it with a question. So opening the grid to a privately run company on an open market scenario, I think may create competition, but it could also place the state and our utility grid in a conditional limbo throughout our contracting actions. I've seen federal and state durations for awarding contracts. You go into negotiation periods. We either can't award based upon your contracting requirements, or your contracts don't meet your contract limitations, and you find that you don't, like I think there's some of the examples that you described, you don't have a contractor to come in and operate your grid. So I'm curious on those sort of timelines and concerns. I'd like to think that someone from the Pine Tree Power team understands what it would take over, or what it would take to take over a massive public utility. I don't know if you have someone from a public works department who understands grappling, taking ownership of such massive amounts of infrastructure that have been currently owned and operated by a private company. We don't understand probably the condition of those utilities. We'd have to conduct studies, develop maintenance plans, and then future development studies. We'd have to hire contractors to do this work, because I'm sure we're not going to be taking on new employees under a state budget to be going out and conducting those studies. So I'd be curious to understand we'd have to, or how the timeline associated with understanding the condition of our infrastructure and then developing our plan for both maintenance and development. I don't think I've heard a significant enough plan to have confidence in transitioning from the status quo. Not that I'm opposed to transitioning from the status quo, but I feel like there's a million questions that need to be developed in terms of, what does it actually look like when we go and say we're buying it, even if they agreed to it. I think you're both right on that we're probably in the 8-year timeline before we even have any clear picture. Say they agreed to a purchase price, and we did come through an acquisition of that infrastructure, developing a plan for us owning it, and then hiring a separate contractor to come in and take maintenance and operation responsibility. I'm curious also on if we understand how many potential companies there even are out there that would be interested in taking on this sort of an operation. And I think we should have a clear cost benefit analysis to display at what point does it, the purchase of the company, the equipment that the company owns, the employees, their salaries and pensions, at what point we need to conduct a study to understand what we're taking over, and then the profit of the new company, and at what point during whatever 15, 20-year, 30-year timeline does that actually become beneficial for the taxpayer? Because I'm sure it's not immediately after acquisition. You're probably 20 plus years out after that timeline. So, what sort of a difference does the taxpayer see in that long-term duration? My question, because I feel like those are things that I'm just tasking everyone with homework, and hopefully you'll respond to as much of it as you can, is why can't we just take the Maine State Utility Commission, a policy or a group that's already in place, and just revise their power to enforce tighter regulations and maybe stricter policies on allowable profits for the power companies that are already here? So, thanks.
Thank you for that. That was a great question. A lot there. I'm digesting it as well. I think your earlier point about the sort of timeline is a real issue. London Economics, when they studied how this might turn out, one of the things they cautioned was there is a limited pool of groups out there who would step in and operate a utility. So that's a reality. Not that long ago, Cross Texas, which is a utility in Texas, did a similar thing. It was a small geography where they took over their local utility, but they couldn't find a grid operator, so the municipality itself had to run the grid. One of the reasons that the International Brotherhood of Electric Workers is so concerned, and why they've come out, and the AFL-CIO has come out against the plan, is because they are very worried about their jobs. They're worried about who they're going to be working for, and they know it's going to be a long and difficult process. And even if some new grid operator comes in, for how long? Because one of the benefits that Our Power talks about is it'll be a competitive process. So you have a job for how long? Until the next RFP happens and a new company comes in. And so those are some of the risks. Now, I think whether or not the Public Utilities Commission should be changed, Governor Mills last year, LD 1959, brought forward a bill. It was debated extensively by the Utilities Committee and ultimately passed. And it put forward performance metrics. And it said, CMP and Versant, you must respond to outages within a certain time. You must make sure your outages don't last too long. You have to return calls. There were 6 different metrics, 5 or 6, and the utilities are being measured on them annually. If they fail to meet those metrics, they can be penalized. If they fail enough, they actually could lose their franchise. So that's in the law right now. So there are some important steps that are being taken, but it's a great question.
We just have 5 more minutes.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I'll be quick. Thank you so much for the great question. This one's important to me because I've worked with utilities commissions a lot, and they can do great work, and I think they have a great job, and we want to empower them to do the best that they can. The tough thing with as it stands now is that no matter what way you slice it, the utility and the utilities commissions, their interests will always be at odds, because it's not CMP and Versant's job to give us good service or to do climate action. Like, that's not in their description. They're not in their job description. They're fundamentally set up to make profit for their shareholders, which is totally fine. That's their job. They're doing their job very well in that regard. And the public utilities job is to protect ratepayers. The difference is that the utility companies are huge, giant, million-dollar corporations that are able to throw their weight around. And so we see that, like many other industries, they're hard to regulate when you have giant companies whose interests are fundamentally not aligned with the people. And that's what'll be different about Pine Tree Power, is that our interests will be aligned, and there won't be that extra profit lying around to do sketchy things with.
Thank you for that question. I appreciate your reflective questions at the beginning as well. And there are a million questions about how the Pine Tree Power Company will decide to operate, and that's the mandate for the board of directors that will be elected. The board of directors in the bill will be responsible for hiring executive leadership, consultants, energy experts, and for appointing some of those energy experts and minds, as you described, on the board. And so all of the questions that you laid out of how can we actually have a competitive RFP process, how do we actually decide the private operations, how is that managed, is all in the authority and discretion for the elected board of directors. So those are really good questions to have, because those are the questions we will be asking the candidates who run for the Pine Tree Power Company. And it shows me how much we can trust ourselves to elect accountable people for that board, because we have folks that are already interrogating that right now.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think that's exactly what we need to do, is use the existing PUC to regulate what's happening. I think we started in the last session. We have more to do. I'd like to use my few points, my few minutes, to say, again, there are 3 reasons that I'm opposed to this. There are 3 reasons why our coalition boasts about 140 organizations and businesses in Maine. 11,000 Mainers have stood with us, and that's because we need to all be fighting together to deal with the climate crisis that faces us right now. The idea of a politically elected board is very risky. Too many unanswered questions. And third, we are talking about billions of dollars that, regardless of how you slice it, we are going to start in debt. A new entity in debt. That is something we cannot argue. And that debt is going to be paid for by all of us. Thank you.
So I'm going to wrap it up and just say, first of all, thank you all for coming, and just say a couple of, a couple of closing words, because we've gone around about this in the legislature 4 or 5 years. And I'd encourage everyone, when you're voting on this, and we're going to have to make a decision one way or another, to take the emotion out of it. And as I talk to the legislators, I mean, this is essentially a business decision. And in a business decision, you cannot eliminate all risks. You can eliminate some risks, but there's always going to be risks. And any business decision comes down to evaluating the rewards versus the risk. And you can lose tremendous opportunity by not taking risks and you don't get the rewards, or you can have great failure by taking too many risks for not enough reward. And so that's what your decision is this November, is to evaluate what are the potential risks, what are the potential rewards, and is this something we want to do? So thank you again for coming, and we look forward to more discussion.
And a special thanks to Mark Lawrence for being here with us. Thank you.